All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being with us today. I know it's an honor to have so many guests from around the country travel in for this historic and important event today. I'm honored to be able to join this esteemed group of local elected officials for our session today, and really it's a privilege. I get to work under the leadership of Julie Chavez Rodriguez in the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, and really excited for everything that she's accomplished and the way that she's led our team. But really the most important thing is that we have our local elected officials here joining us to share their stories and the impacts that they're making at the local level. Really the president is committed to not only working hand in glove with various partners across the country, but really emphasizing the leadership of local elected officials and the impact that they're making in their own community. So with that, I'd love to be able to introduce our group here. We have Representative Sam Park from Georgia. Representative Park is the first Asian American Democrat and first openly gay man elected to the Georgia State Legislature. He's the grandson of refugees from the Korean War and the son of Korean immigrants. And as the minority whip in the Georgia House Democratic Caucus, Sam is the first Asian American in Georgia's history elected to a leadership position in either caucus or chamber. Please give it up for Representative Park. And to his left, we have Delegate Kathy Tron. Since her election in 2017, Kathy has introduced and passed bills to protect coverage for pre-existing conditions, expanding voter access, improving workers' rights, and protecting waterways, and making Virginia more welcoming and inclusive. She spent 12 years working at the U.S. Department of Labor and at the National Immigration Forum. And when she was just 7 years old, Kathy Tron fled from Vietnam with her parents as refugees. As the delegate for Southern and Southeast Fairfax County in Virginia, Kathy fights to protect the values that let her parents risk everything to come to the United States: hope, opportunity, and freedom. Please give it up for Representative Tron. And next we have Assemblymember Evan Lowe. I think he takes the crown for the furthest distance traveled to be with us today, but Assemblymember Lowe has represented Silicon Valley since 2014. He's first held elected office as council member for the city of Campbell, where he went on to make history in 2010 as the youngest open LGBTQ mayor in the country. Assemblymember Lowe now serves as chair of the AAPI Legislative Caucus. During his time as an elected official, Assemblymember Lowe has authored numerous laws that have increased government transparency, advanced equality, and reformed the criminal justice system. Please give it up for Assemblymember Lowe. So I'd like to take the time now to ask all our panelists a question here, and I think we heard some of it from Mayor Pirval earlier, but each of you represents vastly different parts of the country where AA and NHPI populations varies in size and capacity. What inspired you to run for elected office in your area? And what's the favorite thing about the districts and the communities that you represent? We'll start with you, Representative Park.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. What inspired me to run for office back in 2016 was my mother. In 2014, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and it was public health insurance, Medicaid and Medicare, that gave her a fighting chance. That same year, back in 2014, Republicans in the Georgia State Legislature blocked Medicaid, which was, of course, part of the Affordable Care Act, part of Obamacare, and that left more than 500,000 Georgians who still, to this day, don't have access to health care. Georgia ranks at the very bottom of this country when it comes to so many different health metrics, including infant and maternal mortality. Based on that hardship, I decided to do something about it. Of course, Georgia being the cradle of the civil rights movement, it's that legacy of if there's something not right, you have to say something, you have to do something. And so I decided to run for office. I challenged a 3-term Republican chairwoman in a leaning Republican district, and I ended up unseating her and winning the very same night that Donald Trump became president of the United States. Thank you. part of the opportunity that I had to serve was in part because of one of the reasons why I love my district and my community, which is its diversity. My district is located in the heart of Gwinnett County, which is the second largest, most diverse county in the state of Georgia. And it's really become part of the political epicenter of the state of Georgia. And as the mayor said previously, empathy is absolutely key, certainly in the political arena, but certainly when it comes to building multiracial, multi-generational coalitions. And in sharing that story and sharing why I was running for office with thousands of voters in my district, I was able to build that empathy, build that trust, and understanding that no matter where you come from, we all want access to health care. And certainly everybody should be given that opportunity to fight, especially if they're given a terrible healthcare diagnosis. But again, in doing so, history, the rest is history, so to speak.
Wonderful. Delegate Tron.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. How many folks here are from Virginia? Great. Awesome. So you should know we have elections in Virginia every year, and I hope that you'll start with early voting starting on Friday for the Democratic primaries. So I hope that you are figuring out which new districts for the State House and the State Senate that you live in so that you can participate in our elections this year. But I'm Kathy Tran, and I represent parts of southeast southern Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. I was first elected in 2017. I'd never been involved in politics, really, beforehand. The first time I knocked on doors was in 2016 in that presidential election on my wedding anniversary. I was pregnant with my fourth baby, and I was, we split up the girls versus the boys in my team, and we went out and knocked some doors. My husband and I did. But when we had our daughter in 2017, a couple of days after that inauguration, we gave her the name Elise Minkun. Elise was inspired by Ellis Island. My husband has family that were escaping anti-Semitism at the turn of the century, and they passed through Ellis Island. And Minkun is Vietnamese for bright bell, and that was inspired by the Liberty Bell. And so her name means to us to ring the bells of liberty and champion opportunity for all. And I made the decision to run when she was about a month old. The world, you remember, in 2017 was catching on fire, and it got a lot worse, and now it's getting better, right? But I realized, I couldn't give a baby this very, inspiring name, these big shoes to fill, and then just sit on the sidelines myself. And so I was a mom of 4 then, and I realized I needed to just roll up my sleeves and do that work. And so just jumped headlong into the political process. And so I remember the first conversation I had when I was interviewing my campaign manager, and he was like, have you ever raised money for anything? And I was like, no, I've never even sold a box of Girl Scout cookies. How hard can this be? And so if I knew then what I know now, maybe I would be less brave about it. But then it was just about doing the right things for my kids, for my community, and they've truly been my North Star throughout my time in the House. I love where I am in this part of Northern Virginia. We have a lot of public space. And so I get to enjoy our state park, which happens to be the first state park that we took a hike in as a family when we first had our oldest. So it's just, I felt like I came full circle around that. But I do want to emphasize, I come from a majority white community right now. And so when I was knocking on doors, the first question I asked then, and in every election cycle since, is, I'm here to hear about the things that matter most to you. What's on your mind? And some people can immediately answer, and others are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were going to be here. I hadn't thought about it, right? But it's asking that question to understand what's top of mind for the families that live in my community, and making that connection is incredibly important to me, and the constituent services that we've provided to know that we're here for the community, whatever it is, to help make our government function better, I think has helped put us in a good position.
Assembly member.
Good morning and happy AAPI Heritage Month to each and every one of you. Why you decided to listen to politicians speak is why is that the case? Versus some Hollywood stars, performers, why did you decide to join in this room listening to politicians speak? Yes.
Michael Chapman, Santa Barbara, California, because your experience would be a reflection of my inner South guy, or my inner South experience that I would really wanted to emulate and to achieve in the same place.
Santa Barbara. Well, thank you very much for traveling all this way as well. Any other reasons? Why else, or were you voluntold to be here too, to fill up this room? Yes.
I work in business. I've always done private sector, like follow the Asian parent path, and I think for me, I'm seeing that a lot of change happens at state and local levels, and it's frankly the stuff that's like not sexy and it's like not what you're told to go do, right? And so I think hearing the perspective. Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah. I come from a business background. I think for me, it's always been scary to jump into politics and to see myself represented, but just understanding more about how this country works, so much happens at the state and local level, and understanding how you guys have able to chart that path and how you're able to make impact and make real change in the lives of people is really inspiring.
Thank you. I see a few more hands.
Hi, my name's John. I'm from San Diego. I think I'm here today because I think just getting a feel for the leadership that you guys are expressing is, like they said, it's something that's very, very inspiring and something to look up to. It's something that gets overlooked all the time because the focus is always on the national level, but the state and local level is equally, if not more important than that. And I think that's something that we're here because we want to appreciate that and to learn more about it as well.
Daniel Park from Oakland, fellow Californian, I guess.
Oh, the Californians.
Yeah. For me, I think I grew up here in the United States, and I don't want to feel invisible anymore within our community. Things happen to us, our community, and often I felt people just look the other way, then say, "Hey, that's wrong," or "That shouldn't happen to our community." So that's where I think it's important to get involved and really, whether it's legislative or being able to raise money for other Asian American politicians to advance our interests so that we protect our community. So.
Mayor heard that he's looking to help donate campaign political contributions. For all politicians, candidates, you should go to this gentleman in the front.
Hi, good morning. I'm Cedric. I just want to hear about, similar to the last question.
Are you also from California?
I'm from LA.
How about some non-Californian?
But no, I just want to hear, like, as an Asian American, it's easy to not put yourself out there and get out in front. But you all decided to do that and make an impact on your local communities, and I think that's important, and I want to hear why.
Evan, before you go on, I'd like to say I grew up in California. I grew up out in Downey, outside of Los Angeles, and then we moved to San Diego. So lots of connections.
Non-Californian, please.
Hi. I'm from here, DC. I'm sure. I think it's about time that the Asian American community becomes a huge, impactful political force. It has taken too long, and you are the hope of tomorrow, and I hope you spread a huge movement, and the entire community changes things, and change it widely at the national level and at the local level. It's about time.
Thank you. Maybe you could answer. I'm sorry to co-opt this. I didn't mean to take away from the
Turned it into a
moderator.
town hall.
So my apologies, but I think it's important for us to, as a collective room, this is a dialogue. We're not talking to you, but this is a community conversation. And so to answer the question just about my experience, my name is Evan Lowe. I represent the state in the legislature, representing Silicon Valley. We represent about 500,000 people in the California state legislature. But I am a product of Uncle Norm Mineta and Mike Honda. Period. This is their return on investment, whether or not we like it or not. But they have invested in me and said, we want you to continue this legacy. And it's important to all of those who have spoken for us to seize our moment in time, that we must recognize that we are as American and patriotic as everyone else. And that's why the public service is so important. But just like everyone else, for those who said you don't like politics or a little hesitant, I was supposed to become a doctor like my father. My Chinese father's an optometrist, and he says you should become a doctor. But I also, born and raised, 4th generation Californian, speaking more Spanish than I do Chinese. I realized that I cannot afford to live in the community that I represent. So I served as mayor for the city of Campbell and also currently as a state legislator. I'm turning 40 this year. I cannot afford to live in the community that I represent and work for. One needs to earn, median income required is $275,000. Median. The governor for the state of California, the fourth largest economy in the world, cannot afford to live in the community that I represent. But don't feel sorry for me as a politician. Think about all the service workers and those that are coming from communities of color, the generational experience. And that's why we need to demand more accountability. Their younger generations are being set up for failure, and that is unacceptable under our watch. And this is about the experience that we also live. And by the way, with the xenophobia and the API hate that exists, we need to also seize our moment in time and demonstrate the best of our communities and not be so goddamn Asian. That we must lean into this moment and say, this is unacceptable, we're not going to tolerate this type of experience. Oh, and by the way, when we see the activism about Black Lives Matter, we need to also be engaged in being part of that process. When we see Pride movement, we need to be part of the Pride and LGBT experience about those that are undocumented. We need to be at the airports protesting during the Muslim ban. And it's important. I know that's not Asian. We don't go out on the streets and march and get mad and get upset and protest and write letters to the editor and run for office. But we do not have the luxury any longer because this is about us getting into the arena and doing our respective parts. And so I hope all of you who may be interested in this area, I am to tell you again, I don't like politics, I'm an introvert, but I also have no choice. I have no choice but not to get involved and to participate and also to represent and to reflect and help serve and be in a position to effectuate change in the best positive manner that possible. And that's why it's also the experience of seeing other reps in other places that might not be as progressive as California for us to talk openly like this, but we need to support them in their respective communities as well.
Thank you, Assembly Member, and thank you for grounding us. I think it's really important to understand why people are here and what folks are interested in discussing and hearing about. I think it's a perfect segue to my next question, actually, and I'd love to start with Delegate Dran here. But we see that NHPI representation at the local elected level is definitely increasing, but still far underrepresented. Why is it important to have NHPI representation in government, and how does your identity impact your work?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important in both Representative Park and Assemblymember Lowe have spoken to that. I think having a seat at the table and being able to speak about your life experiences, your professional experiences, the experiences of your family and your communities, and lifting that up is so incredibly important. And I'll share a story. When we were debating raising the minimum wage in Virginia, we're now on a pathway to $15 an hour. A pathway, we're not quite there yet. I spoke about my own family's experience coming to the United States, how my father, who was a dentist in Vietnam, was unable to find a job in the United States originally because people said to him, you don't have the language abilities or you're just too overqualified. He was looking for a job as a dental technician, which here doesn't require a high school diploma, right? So you're overqualified. And the first person who took a chance on him, his name was Sam. We called him Mr. Sam in the family. My parents still have my dad's first pay stub. He made $3.35 an hour because that was minimum wage in the early 80s. And that story about how when you're working these low wage and minimum wage jobs affects your family and its ability to take care of itself, take care of other family members who are in home countries, right? Do all of that work, save for the future. And why it's important to raise the minimum wage was a story, quite frankly, that only I could tell because I'm the only refugee in the House Democratic Caucus, right? And I think also on the other side as well in Virginia. And so that's an example of how sharing your stories and having a seat at the table is so important. And we started in 2021 after the devastating shootings in the Atlanta area, the AAPI caucus in Virginia, and I now chair that caucus. And so for us, it's thinking about how do we, now that we have a seat at the table, continue that hustle and build our political power, and making sure that we have more voices join us, voices that share our values, right? Just because we look the same doesn't mean we're all on the same team. But making sure that we're building that power so that we can continue lifting up the priorities of our community and others as well as good allies.
Representative Park, I'd love to ask you the same question.
Yeah, I think Delegate Tran said it very well. In which if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu, I think there's two specific instances that come to mind in terms of why this is so important. One being the March 16th shooting that happened a few years ago. That was a devastating, traumatic experience for so many of the Asian American communities in Georgia. And as Asian American representatives, we had an opportunity to be their voice and to ensure that their concerns were heard not just within the state of Georgia, but around the country. So to help amplify their fears, their concerns, and to bring about positive change, as in part the impetus for passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was incredibly important. As a more recent example, in the state of Georgia and in many other states across the country right now, we're seeing alien land laws being introduced. These are essentially unconstitutional pieces of legislation that would prohibit non-citizens from owning property in the state. 3 times the state of Georgia moved these bills forward. 3 times I had to kill this bill in the Rules Committee. Passed the Senate with bipartisan support, passed the House Committee twice, but I was able to kill it 3 times in the Rules Committee. The unfortunate reality was that there are some Democratic members who voted for these bills because they didn't understand, 1, the history, and 2, the impact that this would have on so many of our Asian American immigrant communities. And so the experiences that you bring, the voice that you're able to provide for your community by having a real seat at the table, especially at the state level, where you have such a direct impact on so many aspects of our lives, is just a really critical aspect, particularly in this day and age, where we're seeing an increase in violence and discrimination against Asian Americans, for more Asian Americans to get elected to office. Last thing I'll say is, I think in part because we've seen this rise of discrimination and violence against Asian Americans, we've also seen the community recognize that it is not sufficient to be that model minority. And so we've seen just within a short period of time in the state of Georgia, a historic number of Asian Americans running for office and getting elected. And so now we have one of the largest Asian American legislative caucuses in the country. I think California being first, or Hawaii being first. But, again, representation absolutely is critical and does matter.
Thank you, Representative Park. And Assemblymember, I think you were alluding to it in your opening remarks, but maybe you could speak to, how you became an Assembly member from your original path as a doctor. Just joking.
Well, first I want to recognize Richard Pan, who is in the front row. He served as chair of the California Asia Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. He was a doctor. It is a doctor. And chaired the health committee in the legislature. So great to see you, Richard, as well too. I think it's just about the experience of also helping to build the infrastructure that is in place. Yeah. What are some best practices that we can do? Both our respective colleagues, if they're not at the table to effectuate change and speak with the lived experiences and values. Hi, Jennifer. It's important that we are helping to ensure that we stop this type of attacks. So, for example, when we're at the table in California, what we have done, for example, is we passed legislation to require minorities on corporate boards. 20% of corporate boards of companies incorporated in California consist of women and minorities. And of course, we worked with the various caucuses to ensure that we have representation. That's specific because we are there at the table. Hollywood tax credits. Utilizing the tax credits, we incentivize studios to film in California and saying to the studios, we want to see more people of color on films and Hollywood entertainment. That is specific. We have passed legislation to make Lunar New Year an official state holiday. That's the official first state in the nation to do so. We help to ensure that we pass mandatory ethnic studies about the Asian American experience. That's specific, so I'm hopeful that we can provide blueprints for other states to emulate, because what this essentially does is help to ensure that this will be transformative for generations to come, which is we will come and go, but for future generations to know through ethnic studies, to making sure that corporate America knows that the Asian American experience is valued, to making sure that we see people and faces of underserved communities. And by the way, this is also about allyship. And when we're talking about the Asian American experience, we cannot talk about that without talking about the solidarity with other communities as well. And hopefully that emboldens others to help support this wider ecosystem about the shared values and the shared experiences that are so critically important to this. But finally, it's also about addressing the elephant in the room. We are seen as the lowest on the totem pole in terms of the political engagement, in my experience. It might be that, okay, it might be the black community, LGBT community, Jewish community. We're always the afterthought, that model minority that Sam talked about. So therefore, you don't need help. You're self-sufficient. And so we have to reframe and talk about also disaggregated data. Because when we think about disaggregated data and say, okay, for example, even in the University of California system and the UC systems, Chinese and Koreans and Japanese may be doing very well at Berkeley and UCLA. When we disaggregate the data, we see that Hmong, Laotian, and others, the statistics don't prove and bear that out. So how is it important that when we're talking about this aspirational term of Asian Pacific Islander, that we're recognizing the disparities within our own communities as well, and also addressing, by the way, the inherent challenges and fights within our own community that is also part of the evolution that exists for us. That's, I think, the next level of us to be able to tackle, which is the evolution of our community, seizing our place, but then saying, uh-oh, now we have to realize how do we work together in a multicultural set within the Asian Pacific Islander community.
Delegate Tran, I have a question for you. So you chair the Virginia AAPI caucus and introduce bills to recognize the importance of teaching AAPI history in the United States and in Virginia. Can you share more about your legislative priorities in the state and on behalf of the AA and NHPI community?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So I do want to just say a little bit like this issue around teaching AAPI history and how important it is, I think has been seized on by both sides of the aisle. And in some places, there's good, strong bipartisan support. In Virginia, I had a resolution this year that said this is really important and we need to prioritize this. And because of the way we set up our curriculum generally in Virginia, it's not done through legislation, right? But that was voted down, like a simple resolution, which is like, we all agree to this principle, was voted down, and I was told that all histories matter. The next day, there was a bill that came in by a colleague across the aisle that set up an advisory board on AAPI history. The advisory board did not require any members to be AAPI or have any expertise in AAPI history, and it was very concerning in a number of other respects as well. So we worked really hard to highlight all the deficits of that approach and the fact that it was clear pandering to our communities. And I think I'm not sure how much we are allowed to be political, but I think our community needs to be clear-eyed, right, when approached by politicians and people and elected officials and people in leadership positions. How are our priorities and our values truly being achieved by those individuals? I think that's really important because I think that was a clear pandering attempt. And even though all of our amendments to that proposal were defeated on the floor, they were all taken up in the state Senate. So I just think that was really interesting, right? Like the politics of that. But our caucus has been focused on a number of issues, particularly language access equity. We've moved the needle a little bit in Virginia, making sure that Medicaid, for example, information is provided in all languages. We got some money for the first time in the budget for language access equity, but we're still working on that issue, working to help lift up our small business owners and entrepreneurs, passed some bills that really looked at some predatory financing practices and protecting them. In Virginia on that was targeting our immigrant businesses. We're also focused on our English language learners and making sure that they have the supports that they need. And the last is really addressing hate and violence directed to our community as well. So that's kind of gives you a sense of some of the ideas that our caucus works together on. And then also working in allyship with the Latino caucus and the Black Legislative Caucus. We have our state Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, who just the other week publicly said that DEI is dead. It should be a cow that is killed in Virginia. We shouldn't be addressing that anymore. So the 3 joint caucuses came out with a statement calling for his immediate resignation. I think we've all spoken a little bit about that allyship and how important it is, because the fight for racial and economic justice is one we do together. And when one of us rises, we all rise, right? This is not a deficit of hope and opportunity in this country and in each of our individual states. I think that's the other piece that our caucus is really cognizant about, is working in allyship.
Representative Park, I know you've served quite some time in your current position, but you actually serve as the minority whip in the General Assembly and are the only Asian American in House leadership. I would love to learn a little bit more about your journey, especially knowing that as the AAPI community is rapidly growing, in the country and in Georgia, certainly not the case that you're completely represented in the state, and so would love to know, how your ascent looked in House leadership.
Sure. So I've been elected to office in the Georgia legislature 4 times now. So I've had an opportunity to build. Thank you. I've had an opportunity to build relationships, which takes time, with a very, very diverse caucus that's actually representative of the diversity that exists in the state of Georgia. As Kathy said, you have to build coalitions not just by talking, but by being there, by fighting for the same issues that others are fighting for. Last year, during redistricting, that was an incredibly challenging period of time, especially for the state of Georgia, where for the first time since 1965, the protections of pre-clearance were not present, meaning our Republican-controlled legislature could brazenly engage in racial and partisan gerrymandering, which is exactly what they did. In the state Senate, they drew out the first Asian American woman elected to the state Senate, Senator Michelle Au. And at the state level, again, lots of partisan gerrymandering, but also at the local level. Traditionally, at the local level, it's the local delegation that's in control of the local maps. At the time, I had served as chair of the Gwinnett delegation, again, a county of about 1 million people, a very, very diverse community. And we got into a very, very big fight with the Republican majority, where essentially what they wanted to do, the chair of reapportionment in particular, she wanted to draw a majority white district in the most diverse county in the state of Georgia that would have unseated the first black woman in 200 years elected to the Gwinnett County Board of Elections, a local office. And so I went all out against this fight because it was outrageous. Republicans were breaking their own House rules to force this through. And I think fighting as hard as I did, it earned a lot of trust and respect with a lot of my members that I currently have the opportunity to serve themselves right now, but particularly members of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. The Georgia Legislative Black Caucus comprising about 2/3 of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. We have the largest Black caucus in the country.
Actually,
Not anymore?
Maryland's bigger.
Okay, we'll count. We'll follow over that. But again, it's the solidarity that you have to demonstrate that earns trust, which I think is how I've had an opportunity to serve in a leadership capacity. And I think going, my general approach has been, especially as I'm trying to build a new majority in the state house that's reflective of the demographics of the state of Georgia, certainly when it comes to the issues that they care about, but it's to serve each member. Strong members equal strong caucus. And so that's been my approach since I've been elected and doing what I can to help other members, but certainly as the minority whip, I've been very intentional with trying to lift up as many members of my diverse caucus as possible.
Thank you, Representative Park. I have a question for Assemblymember Lowe. You chair the AAPI caucus, legislative caucus in California, and authored the historic Lunar New Year bill. Can you tell us a little bit more about that importance? And also would love to know, just in your experience, what makes an effective legislator? What, obviously representation is important, but what makes someone able to pass a bill into law, and you're able to actually get that done very quickly in the legislature and have that signed by the governor? So would love to hear more about that process.
I wish I could tell you that it was an easy task, that making Lunar New Year a holiday in the state of California was an easy task. But the truth and the reality is that it was not easy, which is to say, how does the state recognize that there's a budget augmentation to this? There's an inherent cost. And of course, when you're thinking about new holidays, you say, well, that's going to cost a significant amount of resources. Also, how do you negotiate with workers, and what does that look like? And so the comments I would get back were, you don't need a holiday. Asians don't need a holiday. There's no justification for this. So data points are important. Let's be prepared when we talk about the experience and the work. So for example, in the University of California system, the list of recognized calendared holidays, for example, Indigenous Day, rightfully so, Martin Luther King, there is Juneteenth, there are a number of holidays, Cesar Chavez, and so why crazy me to ask a question, as we recognize the importance of all other communities as well in solidarity, rightfully so. What about the Asian Pacific Islander community, in which the UC California student population, the majority population, consists of Asian Pacific Islanders? And yet we don't have a holiday? Why should we be begging for this? Unacceptable. Thankfully, the chair of the budget committee happens to be Asian Pacific Islander, so that might be also a help. And Governor Gavin Newsom has been a great ally of our API community coming from San Francisco as well. So the experience that he has, there's cultural competency. So we're able to shepherd that through, but that was a multi-year effort to get that to the finish line. But that is the truth, which is to say that I needed to have difficult conversations with other members of the legislature about the difficult conversation about solidarity, in which people said, well, it's not your time. And said, well, let us have a conversation and break bread about the truth. This is about power. This is about recognizing communities. And so, but let's do so in a collaborative fashion. And that is the truth. So at some members, I had to beg. Some I didn't have to do so. But that is the truth in a multicultural society, and how do you effectuate change? And you'd asked about the effectiveness of a legislator. Now, if I came in hot and indignant and said, we demand Lunar New Year, that would probably not go so far. But understanding that different individuals and using key data points to make the justification in a policy is important. And then you can move forward with the efforts accordingly too. But I hope that we can use this as a blueprint for others to say, why not? And how do we get some of these other well-recognized holidays? And how do we replicate those areas of success?
Can I just say, I thought you said something about calling for others to stand in solidarity with us was really important. This year, we also had alien land law bills that were introduced. And I remember in our caucus, right, so the caucus is like each political team, they meet. And so before session started that day, and we were talking about this bill, you know, what was happening with it. And they were like, we don't think we need to stand on the floor and make any comments. And I was like, well, this is what I'm hearing from the community, right? You were talking about having a seat at the table. This is what I'm hearing from the community. The community is really concerned. And our bill was shaped a little bit different. But the language that was being used is always like the Chinese, right? It's not about the government. It's like about the people. And so it's like, we still have some concerns from the community. I want you to know that. And the response I got from a colleague, you know, in the heat of that moment was, well, if you're concerned, you should say something. And then in the heat of the moment, I was like, I should not be the only person who says something every time. And it was like this pause. You could hear a pin drop. And what I heard about it afterwards were members of like the Black Caucus who were like, we shouldn't be the ones who are talking about our issues all the time either. But, and so there was solidarity around that feeling, right, about the weight when you are one of a few in a room, that you have to carry the voices of so many all the time. So that bill comes to committee. And in committee, and we've talked a lot, right? The government is not the people. And so in committee, and it comes up, I had a colleague who was like, excuse me, I don't want any of the witnesses to use the Chinese as a term. If you're talking about the government, then say so. And the chairman said, well, we can't like force witnesses to use particular terms, but thank you for that comment. And then we circle back at the end of this hearing for this bill. I had another colleague on the Democratic side who said, they said, I just want to make sure though, even though we can't tell witnesses what terms to use, you should understand why this is bad. And so like they had this conversation, and then the patron of the bill was like, look, I've been really focused on using the term foreign adversary. I'm trying here. I'm really sorry if I offended anybody. And it was like that moment where I was like, what legislature am I in, right? Like we moved the needle on that conversation, but it was a moment of solidarity and people really taking into account and being careful with the terms that they were using because they did not want to offend, and that I didn't have to carry that water again, right? So I think that's really important. I mean, sometimes you come to this these moments, and you have these hard conversations where you have to say, hey, I really need you as well to be in this battle with me. I can't be the only warrior here.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember and Delegate Tran. I think one of the things that we see and really admire about local government is really people speaking and listening to each other. So it sounds like that's an an experience that both of you have had, and I'm sure Representative Park as well. And I have a question for all our speakers here, and really being able to brag about your states or your own communities. What are things that you're excited about in the coming year, and what are some examples of good policy making that you're seeing at the local level, and frankly, what can we see as an example for us at the federal level? Representative Park?
Sure. So I'm excited, just as a general matter, for 4 more years of President Biden's administration to begin with. And I say that because it's an administration, particularly with the legislative accomplishments, that will be transformative. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act will invest about $4.2 billion in the state of Georgia that will help us accelerate toward renewable energy. In particular, there's about $135 million that's set aside for charging stations, in which we're seeing historic amounts of foreign direct investment from Korean companies, such that Georgia is being hopefully positioned to be a leader in electric manufacturing. Other states certainly will be competing for that title as well. But it's in conjunction with federal, state, and local governments, in which, again, we're truly able to move, especially a conservative state like Georgia, forward on an issue in regards to sustainability and resilience that's absolutely critical when it comes to fighting climate change. There's a lot of exciting things, despite, I think, the challenges that we still face. But certainly from California, with all the various emerging technologies, we're at the precipice of so many breakthroughs that can be absolutely transformative. And so it's that dichotomy I personally struggle with, in which we're facing so much uncertainty, and yet at the same time, the future is right around the corner. But I think it's all the more important, especially at the state level, in which there's greater opportunities for innovation and creativity when facing these problems, and to implement good public policy. That certainly will keep me focused there.
Great. Thank you, Representative. We'll turn to Assemblymember Lowe for an answer to that question.
About what we should be doing?
So, examples of good policy making at the local level. What are things that you're looking forward to heading into the year, and what are ways that you can be a model to us here at the federal level?
I think I mentioned some of it already. Passing mandatory ethnic studies is important for the learned experience of the shared experience that we have. Helping to also the structural changes that I think about. We talked about passing legislation on requiring minorities and women on corporate boards. We talked about actually in response to stopping Asian hate, the state of California passed $165 million of public state funds going to UCLA on key studies with respect to the Asian American experience, ethnic media grants, helping to promote and uplift ethnic media publications to help tell our stories of cultural competency in the areas that matters the most. But this is a reflection of our values. So $165 million in public funds going to be spread and distributed across the entire state is a reflection of our public values, and if we can help to replicate that, that's important. I think the other challenge that we're facing right now, frankly, in California, is we've done so much. What is next? But what we are seeing is the type of vitriolic attacks towards Asian Pacific Islanders and the weaponization. Representative Park talked about the alien land law. We're seeing similar type of legislation popping up and being weaponized in the political arena, targeting that of those who are Chinese, the issue of TikTok. This is very pervasive in the realities that exist, particularly in Silicon Valley, semiconductor and technologies that exist. So I think that's important for us to recognize that this is a battle on all fronts, which is to say that we are being targeted and being weaponized, our members of our community. And by the way, when we're talking about China, many do not distinguish, again, within the Asian Pacific Islander community. And that is what is very frightful, that we're still seen as perpetual foreigners in our own land. And that's why it's incumbent upon us to build solidarity with other communities of these other challenges that exist, and helping to stand firm and strong, and also demanding more for those others who are in these positions. So in the state of California, demanding that Governor Gavin Newsom also stand strong with the Department of Justice and our Attorney General to help ensure that we are prosecuting accordingly, not going to overcorrections and carceral issues, but rather to making sure that we do not tolerate or stand for any of these, and there would be swift repercussions should we see these type of attacks towards our community.
Thank you, Assemblymember Delegate Tran.
Yes, and as we close out, I just want to recognize Prince George's County Councilwoman Monica Fisher, who also served in the Maryland State House. She's one of my sisters. I think for us in Virginia, we have really moved the needle on voting access. So we passed our own Virginia Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial gerrymandering and political gerrymandering. We've also have one of the longest early voting periods in the country at 45 days. Don't forget, primary voting starts on Friday. And we've made it started automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. So it just gives you some of the examples of what we've done. One of those things that I helped lead was to embed into our code the requirements for language access. So my big ask, knowing that some of these voting laws are right now, we're still trying to work out what's happening federally. My big ask, though, is funds for state and localities to do voter translation of materials. That costs money. Some of our local governments want to and voluntarily translate materials into languages that they're not required to do so under the Voting Rights Act. But if we're able to support that with some grants, then I think more local governments would voluntarily do that, and it would really open up the way for people to participate. So many of us, right, and our families came to this country to be able to participate in our government without any repercussions and to have that voice. And so I think fundamentally, to get at all the issues that we've talked about today, it's making our voices heard, and that's one way we can get some help at the federal level.
I'd like to just close out here asking a few questions I think that folks might be interested in asking you, but what advice would you give to others who might be considering running for office? And Representative Park, I'll start with you.
Especially for those in the room who are interested, you got to follow that conscience, right? You have one life to live. If you're interested in running for office, explore it, and make sure if you are going to run that you do it for the right reasons, right? That you're doing it to give back. All of us, and certainly Evan with the legacy that he's inherited, we stand on the shoulders of folks who have paved the way for us. As Mayor Purval has done in the Midwest, we're all in our own ways, breaking barriers and widening the path for the next generation. That's part of our responsibility as well. Running for office, leading is absolutely critical for us to do that. So we're continuing to carry that torch and that legacy, because this is a nation of immigrants, right? We are, that American story, that is only possible here. And we have to own that. We have to empower ourselves with the ability and go forth.
Thank you, Representative. I'll turn it over to Assemblymember Lowe.
I just think that we are in a unique time and an evolution now. What is our equivalent of an NAACP? What's our equivalent of a Emily's List, or equivalent of a human rights campaign? What is the equivalent of NALEO? This is an opportunity for us to gather. And when there's an incident of a chancellor making racist comments at Purdue, who is going to organize us at the national level to ask for accountability? When there are incidents in Texas and other places, who's going to galvanize us? And that's the moment in time for all of us to answer that question. That we all take this experience and that we elected to be in this room for the further cause of each other. So let's stay connected. And so for those of you who are interested in public service in that way, please feel free to connect with any of us. But just know that you're not alone. And that if you have reservations or hesitations, we're all human. This is not culturally part of the norm for Asian Pacific Islanders. but you see that this is a unique moment in time of this experience, so we'd love to chat with you.
Yes.
And finally, we'll conclude with Delegate Tran.
I'd say just do it. I mean, there's never going to be the perfect time, the perfect office, that perfect moment. And if you're feeling that tug, we need your voices. And we've tried to make the case why it's important for us to be at the table, to continue building our political power once we're at the table, and being the voices for our communities and sharing that personal and professional experiences that only you have, right? If I know now if I knew then what I know now, right, when I first was going to run, I would have talked myself out of it. I had 4 kids. One of them was 1 month old, right? I now have 5 kids, right? So like you just have to jump in to the deep end. And I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to help you float and swim and get to that finish line. And so if you need us to help, the mayor or anybody else, but I know that, within your community, they're going to lift you up as well. So just do it.
Well, thank you all for joining today. This concludes our panel for this morning. I do want to announce that there is lunch at the GW Student Center, but more importantly, I just want to thank our panelists who've truly been inspirational and continue to lead our communities in so many different ways in their states and local communities. So please give another round of applause for our panelists here.